Welcome to the Why Letting Agents and Landlords Should Renew EICRs in 2024 webinar. We have our guests Lee Rix from Eco Approach and Dean Falvey from Fixflo in as our panelists today. I'll just wait another minute or so for more people to filter in before we get started. Lee and Dean, how are you doing today?
Morning. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you on.
Morning. Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting stuck into quite a hot topic at the moment, EICRs.
Yeah, slightly overshadowed by the political news from yesterday, but we will charge ahead. Let's get going, shall we? So just a little legal disclaimer. All content presented in this webinar is intended for general information purposes only and should not be considered as legal advice or official guidance. We do have the live Q&A option available in this webinar. So if you go to the Zoom settings and hit the Q&A box, you should be able to ask your questions there and we will get round to them at some point either during the webinar or at the end. Welcome to our panelists. Dean and Lee, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, sure. I'm Dean Falvey. I'm the contractor network manager at Fixflo. My background is mainly in managing national field service operations and working with tradespeople to deliver reactive and planned services. So EICRs kind of fits very well into that.
And I'm Lee Rix, the Director of Business Development of Eco Approach, and we are said contractors that Dean just described. So we're offering fully national services for landlords and letting agents in all manner of compliance, and EICRs, of course, being a key topic in our discussion chats.
Fantastic. And I'm Jonty. I'm part of the marketing team here at Fixflo, so I will be emceeing today. Lee, let's kind of start with the basics. EICR renewals have been coming into the news quite a lot recently. So what actually is an EICR? What are the requirements and why are they suddenly kind of coming back into the news again?
Yeah, of course. So to break it down, an EICR is an electrical installation condition report. That's the massive verbiage behind the acronym. Some people call it a landlord safety check. Some people just call it an electrical safety check. Ultimately, it's to ensure that the occupant within a property is not at risk or to reduce as much risk as possible from fire and of course, electrical shocks. The idea was that you've had gas safety certificates as a legal requirement on landlords for years and years. Agents and landlords alike should be well aware of those. But there was this interest in space for electrical safety, and it was highly recommended but not mandated. So that was addressed correctly, in my opinion, back in 2021. So ultimately now every property, every tenancy must have an active EICR in place that just assures that the property is being checked thoroughly by the right people to make sure that occupant's safe. And they can pass and fail. I'm sure we'll go into the ins and outs of exactly how these work. But the reason that it's so relevant all of a sudden is that major change came in quite suddenly back in 2020, and then an amendment in 2021 that we'll talk about. But ultimately, we're now seeing the first big renewal. So all of that mental ramp up of EICR volumes that we saw 4 years ago is now kicking into effect. So that's probably why we're all hearing that buzzword about EICRs and renewals at this stage.
So can you tell us a little bit about what it was actually like last time in 2020, 2021 when this legislation came into effect?
Yeah, absolutely. So it came in pretty suddenly. So it is something that had been on the agenda for a very long time, but then it just felt like it dropped pretty immediately with the government turning around and saying, well, here you go, this is now legislation. So just to cast your mind back, it was July 2020 that the first round kicked in, and that was for all new tenancies. So if you had an existing tenant and you weren't having any changes or anyone moving in or out, you were unaffected by that. So you kind of heard this rumor on the grapevine that EICRs are coming, but what do I need to do about it? But it was the hard backstop of April 2021. By 2021, you had to have an EICR in place. So you can just imagine that ridiculous scramble of trying to get the labour in to do these EICRs, because, and again, as I'm sure we'll discuss throughout this, that the requirement and the capacity needed to service that many EICRs and do the remedial works, make sure these properties are all safe within that set specified amount of time, was a wild ask. And what we're concerned about now is that, well, if everyone jumped through those hoops and ran around the streets trying to scream and find an electrician who can do their EICR 5 years ago. We're concerned that we're going to have an exact repeat of that unless agents are able to be that conduit between the landlords and the contracts, that's us, to try and pre-plan this a bit better. Let's try and forecast when the peaks are coming and how we can start to flatten this curve.
I think I had similar experiences. I think I wasn't at Fixflo at the time, but I was in a similar kind of marketplace environment, and it became clear very early on that there was just not enough capacity to meet the demand, and that the effects of that I found were really some ridiculous and silly pricing. So pricing was really inconsistent. Landlords and letting agents were seeing some very expensive invoices land, and they were having to agree to these rates begrudgingly in order to kind of meet their requirements for ensuring that there's an EICR at a property. And I just remember the constant everyone scrubbing around trying to secure capacity. And then beyond that, there was also a real influx of tradespeople who didn't have the appropriate qualifications to complete EICRs, either through lack of 18th edition or they didn't have any kind of the cert or inspection requirements that they needed, or their registration, and would often get a friend to sign off those certs, and that places real risks on landlords and letting agents. And I think we're going into this renewal, as Lee talks about it, in terms of all that knowledge we've gained through those experiences 4 years ago. I think the key thing is probably what do we do with that knowledge now, and how do we move it forward to ensure that we're not experiencing the same issues we did last time. But it really was a crazy time. We used to have a bit of a running joke that the Lamborghini dealerships were selling out because electricians were driving around in Lamborghinis. There was so much work and so much demand pent up that they were essentially able to kind of charge what they like.
And there was also the other side of it, that the electrical field is not quite as black and white as the gas field, as an example. I referenced it earlier because hopefully people are familiar with that sector being in property. To do an EICR, it's not just, are you an electrician? There are a few variations to it, and you've got to look at the electricians that have also got their testing and inspection that Dean was just touching on there. And we were seeing huge problems with an electrician going out to a property who doesn't often do testing and inspection, isn't able to sign off their own certificate. So they would go and do some arbitrary testing based on what they think is right at the property. And like Dean said, have somebody who is qualified sign it off without even attending. And that was possibly through desperation of trying to just deliver for their clients. And of course, you're naturally going to get bad actors coming into the scene there who just see this as a bit of a cash cow to all of a sudden jump on board and start making money out of it. So again, it's what did we learn 4 and 5 years ago that we can hopefully figure out and try and piece together and put forward as a proposition to A, give a bit of market stability in terms of pricing, and B, and probably more importantly, is not let the quality drop. So there were people cutting corners, there was sample testing that kicked in all of a sudden, and visual inspections only, and some of the readings you could tell had just been copy and pasted from anywhere and everywhere. And so although the country and landlords everywhere did mobilize and get this done, did they do it right the first time? Was the person acting with their best interests and to the right technical element? Or are we going to start unpicking those as we go, which we have been doing consistently for the last 4 years? And it is a lot more expensive to try and right these wrongs.
I agree. I think there was one more thing that came from last time. I think naively, I don't know what your thoughts were, Lee, at the time, but I just did not expect the level of remedials that came back off the back of these visits. And you thought you had a problem getting through all of those EICRs, and then essentially you were creating new problems by when those certificates coming back with, C1 and C2 failures, which I'm sure we'll talk about some of the technical bits later on, that the level of work, the revisits required. So you're kind of having to redouble your efforts and in terms of trying to deal with those capacity issues. Certainly the common theme last time from our perspective was consumer units. There just seemed to be wholesale replacement of consumer units because the regs were quite specific around the materials that those consumer units should be made with, and there was a lot of those consumer units out there that didn't meet those requirements. And it'll be interesting to see how that differs this time, if at all. I think would be quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And also you talk about the remedial works there. There's definitely a difference between us going out and doing an assessment on a domestic property that somebody lives and owns versus one that's a rental property. And I know it's not necessarily the nicest picture to paint, but there are certainly properties out there that we've seen that probably don't get as much love and affection because they're rental properties. They're seen as assets that should just generate value, as opposed to thinking about, well, if you had your own kids in that house, how would you react to some of these changes? Versus if it's just a rental property and you don't know who the tenant's going to be next year. There was definitely a gap in that. I mean, we do over 1,000 EICRs a month here currently. A high percentage of that is for rental properties, and the fail rate of EICRs, unfortunately, is a bit higher on the rental side of it. And it does come from that often landlords don't want to stump up an investment to go through and do something that, I mean, I get it. Electrics aren't exactly a sexy item to go and redo the property and increase the rental yield. But actually, we need to look at this from a completely different perspective, and actually the prevention of electric shocks and fire. And we've seen how key that can be.
Absolutely.
True.
So we've talked a little bit there about what it was like last time, and also briefly touched on, the differences this time. So what is there that is going to be different this time to last time? And is it worth actually being concerned about?
I think there are going to be a couple of differences as kind of we see it. I think the first one is that there just isn't going to be that leeway that there was in the past. When new regs come in or new requirements, there is inevitably an element of leeway in terms of if some compliance deadlines are missed, but you're going at it with the best of intentions to secure the capacity. There's a bit more kind of forgiveness. I don't think that's going to apply this time round. I think it's reasonable to assume that these regs have been introduced for a reason. I think many in the industry are aligned that these regs are a good thing, as Lee touched on. I think, there isn't going to be that leeway. So it's really going to come down to securing the capacity early on at a reasonable market rate rather than some astronomical pricing. And I think what else will be different is inevitably electrical regulations, they develop and they change all the time. And where we had a theme last time for the remedials, we touched on consumer units and things like that. Inevitably, I think there's going to be a new theme in these, in terms of what will be different this time. Regs would have come on. There'll be certain checks or standards that need to be met, and inevitably there's going to be failures in them. And I think the themes will begin to emerge as we ramp up this EICR tsunami that's coming, and I think there'll be some common themes in terms of remedials that are coming back, and then that kind of goes back to those challenges I talked about before around, the volume is challenging enough without then having to kind of factor in those revisits and those remedials and do them within a reasonable period of time. I think for me, they're probably the standout items. I think are probably going to be a bit different this time. I don't know, Lee, from the contractor perspective, whether you see it any different. It'd be quite interesting.
Yeah, well, just to go back on the point of leniency and talking about the regulations, how they're set up. So there are hefty fines associated with non-compliance here, a maximum fine of up to £30,000, which I'm sure any landlord will find fairly unpalatable. And you talk about this regulation that felt like it just exploded into life back in 2020, 2021. It felt like that for us in the industry. It felt like that for landlords, and it absolutely felt like that for the local authorities. So the way that this legislation was written is that it's up to the local authorities to police this. Now, did I hear horror stories of massive fines 1 month after this come in? No, I didn't, because I think a few things happened. Local authorities weren't ready. They didn't know how to police this. They were caught as much as we were with it. The industry wasn't prepped. I think the powers that be knew that. I think they probably had a better handle on data of number of electricians versus number of rental properties than we've ever had. And then, yeah, of course, there wasn't that much warning either. So I suspect this was kind of dropped on us, but almost left to everyone's own devices to go and use best efforts to get compliant. Whether you were compliant by April 2021 or not, although at the time it felt very significant, perhaps that wasn't the key driver here. But what we've got to look at now is that we're 4 or 5 years down the line. There'll be a ton of properties that forget about this unless it's communicated well with them. I've no idea if there's going to be massive ad campaigns from government or Ofcom or any of these places, and I think it is going to be down to agents to effectively treat this like a boxing match and protect yourself at all times. And protecting yourself is protecting your landlords. You've got to get that information out there to them to avoid this, because I'm certain that these guys are going to be wanting to make that money. I mean, my local authority, Croydon, went bankrupt, so I'm sure they're going to be looking to pull in a few pounds anywhere they can, and that's going to be a big factor here. And then just moving on to the points that you made, Dean, about the remedial works. I mean, anything from a cracked socket to a full rewire, we've seen it all. We've seen absolutely everything. So probably a good time to maybe explain the process of an EICR and how the codes that you'll see on the big graph that you get on the bottom. You've got 4 different codes that can come up. So you've got your C1. So that's something that's immediately threatening to life, something very dangerous that we have a duty to resolve there and then. Whether that's remedy it right there or whether it's cut the power, it's one or the other. It depends on what the issue is and what the capacity is there and then. But that could be something like some exposed live parts. You've then got your C2s, which are considered potentially dangerous. So they're still in the bracket, and you'll see the definition on an EICR: urgent remedial works required. That's where you've got 28 days to get those rectified. A C1 has to be rectified there and then effectively, but C2s, you've got 28 days to get those sorted. That could be absence of main protective bonding or earthing, or an RCD that doesn't trip in time when we test it. You've got 28 days to get those resolved and get the correct certification issued after it. Then you've got your C3s. Now, these are recommendations, and I think this is going to be a big point of what you were talking about, Dean. So if you think about an MOT on your car, like, you have to get certain bits done there and then to get past. But any recommendations that come up are probably going to fail on your next MOT. I had one recently, actually, with my tyres. They were starting to get bald, and I know that's me changing a tyre before my next MOT. We're going to see a lot of that. So although a landlord thinks they've got a clean bill of health because they had any C1s and C2s rectified there and then, the C3s might be something that's changed now. That can be, like you said, regulation changes. We had an update to 18th edition in 2022, so there's some changes there. But also it's the condition and the usage of the property. If you've got a family of 6 in a house, the house is going to be pretty lived in, isn't it? It's going to be pretty worn, especially if you've got 4 kids running around causing chaos. Of course, that property is going to be worn. It's down to the electrician on site to make those judgments based on their experience as to whether those C3s are now pushing over the threshold of becoming something that needs to be dealt with now. And just to caveat that as well, the final code that you'll see is FI, stands for further investigation. And that's ultimately if we're unhappy about something, a reading's coming back as not optimal, but we haven't got the time to fully investigate that. It could take hours. You think we're talking about the wiring within a property. I'm not sure many people think about this, but you can imagine how many wires you've got running between your walls, between your loft spaces and your ceilings. We've got to be confident enough to sign our name on it to say that all of that is absolutely A1, and it will be for the next 5 years. So of course it's going to take in the electrician's personal experiences and opinions into that as well. So you might see some further investigations because we've only allotted, say, 4 hours for an EICR, and actually we might need to spend another 4 hours just tracing one circuit to find out what's going on and why is that reading not as happy as it should be. So yeah, we're definitely going to see a decrease in leniency and an increase in old certificates that tell you had a clean bill of health changing a bit. And also the quality of the EICR that was done before. If it wasn't done by us, it's outside our spans of control, and we might have a differing opinion based on what we're willing to put our name to.
I think that's a good. Yeah, we were talking before. I said this is an opportunity for Lee to provide a good explainer of an EICR and the possible outcomes, and I think that kind of sums it up nicely for everyone, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lee. So it sounds like there's a lot of EICRs to be done just in general, and also a massive amount of remedial work that could pop up. So is there concern that there's actually not going to be enough supply of qualified electricians to actually, cover all of these works that need to be done?
Yeah.
Yes, there is. Absolutely. I think Lee's probably on the same page. I think anyone who thinks otherwise really, I think, is burying their head in the sand. There's definitely going to be capacity issues. So I think, if you look, we focus on letting agents, and they'll have their own electricians and people that they're using. I think that the reality is, and probably what letting agents found in the past, is that the people that they've been able to rely on to date won't necessarily have the capacity to kind of carry them through this wave of EICRs. And with the best of intentions, and I'm sure that contractor is a great contractor and will continue to do their utmost. Ultimately, they're one business or one person, and there are limitations in terms of physics. They can only be in one place at one time and can't go to others. So I think in terms of kind of what we're doing on the marketplace side of things at Fixflo is that we are, we're getting in early to secure resource, so secure those contractors, get their buy-in. We have great insights in terms of data of what's coming down the pipeline in terms of when due dates are. We can be really forensic with them and support them to understand when it's coming and when they might drop off a little bit, what the impact of the remedials will be, and so on. So we're working with contractors, and they're really vetted and compliant contractors of the right caliber and of the right standard, to ensure that these EICRs are done to the right standard that we'd expect. They're done within the due dates that people are expecting, and really importantly, for a reasonable market rate, and not let these things get carried away. And I think that's really important, I think, for anyone who's kind of thinking about how are we going to deal with these EICRs that are coming up. It's great to know that you've got avenues like marketplace and other people to lean on in addition to your existing contractor base. I think we, as part of that, we're also kind of calling out the risks that are associated with this, and even this webinar is part of that. I think we're here having quite a frank discussion around our experiences last time and the things that happened. And I think the risks for me are three kind of key things. One is capacity. So if people aren't acting to secure that capacity, there's a real risk that you're not going to meet compliance deadlines. And Lee talked nicely around, how we do really suspect there's going to be a different level of enforcement this time around. And that we've talked already around the non-qualified tradespeople. I'm sure there's people with the best of intentions who have good skill set and things, and there's also that combination of what Lee talked about, bad actors. And I think it's just simply not worth the risk in terms of what's involved there. So how are you truly sure that someone is compliant and meets the correct regulatory requirements to complete that EICR and the subsequent remedial works, particularly if there's new installations? How are you sure about that? And I think one of the biggest risks, which I think we learned last time, is just not acting soon enough. I think there might be people who think, my EICR peak doesn't really start till Q1, Q2 next year. I assure you that a significant proportion of that capacity is already used up or been secured. So it's definitely better to get ahead of the game, I think, in terms of securing the capacity and beginning to think, how are we going to execute this and on time and avoid all of those risks? And I think, having discussions like this is a great kind of way of doing that. And I think certainly as part of the insights I've gained through Marketplace and also speaking to customers and contractors, I think everyone's kind of aligned that we know it's coming, but there's kind of this procrastination around, do we do something about it? Do we not? And I think, everyone probably just needs to have the confidence that it's better to get ahead of this now and start securing some resources. That means allocating jobs well in advance to secure rates, the best possible rates and things like that. These are the practical things I think we can be doing.
Yeah, and just talking about the rates there as well, this should be a more palatable sell into your landlords, really, because let's say their EICR is valid for, say, 3 to 5 years is about the average. To bring that forward by a year doesn't mean you're writing off vast sums of money because you've spent huge sums on an EICR. I mean, they're not the most expensive item out there. There's certainly going to be scope for you to say to your agents, look, yeah, I know you might have paid, I don't know, 150, 200 quid, depending on where they got their EICR done previously. And yes, you could look at that as a 5-year investment, but actually bring it forward 3 years. And I bet you your EICR will be a lot cheaper because the market rates, like you said, it's going to be volatile, it's going to go up. And if any remedial works are required, you're at risk of non-compliance for them not being done in 28 days. And also you're at risk of it costing a fortune because you'll get one of the Lamborghini gang turning up at that time.
Yeah, we do actually have
still out there
that we can use to visualize how much more in demand EICRs are going to get. So we're sitting over here in 2024 where there's not a huge demand for EICRs because the due dates aren't rolling around yet. If you go into 2025, there are 4 times as many EICRs that are coming due in 2025, and then it's peaking the year after that. So it's really this graph really shows the massive jump year on year over the next couple of years as to the EICRs that are going to be needed.
And it comes back to your question on the last point there. It was, is there a concern there's not going to be enough labour to supply? And me and Dean both just basically laughed and said, yeah, of course there is, because there wasn't enough labour last time. We know that. We experienced that. We've seen it. Unfortunately, we're all old and grey enough to have felt the pain of that. And the question is, well, how many more electricians are there versus how many have retired in the last 4 to 5 years? We know that as a country, we struggle with apprenticeships and getting young people into these trades roles. And also with EICRs, it's not just an electrician, it's someone experienced in doing that testing and inspection that it just takes time to build up that knowledge and know where to look and what to look for. Then you factor in, I mean, just talk about us as a business, right? So 5 years ago, there was a massive focus on EICRs, but now we've got a huge focus on trying to deliver the country towards a net zero status, which ultimately means our electricians are spending infinite amounts of time on solar panels now that they weren't doing 5 years ago. So some of that labour is being taken up there. Same with electric vehicles. Like the rate in which we're installing our EV charge points, again, is detracting our pool of labour away from just doing EICRs. So I don't see that the supply of electricians has increased. I don't see that there's any like major changes towards that. Nothing's going to shift before next year to help that out. And if anything, we're probably going to be in an even trickier situation.
I agree. I think what stands out for me when you look at kind of the graph and the peak is that this is not a short term. This is there's a period of about 18 months where there is a real push on that capacity. And I think, it's not just happening in 1 quarter of 1 year, that there is a spread of consistent demand over an extended period of time. There's not going to be any room for anyone to catch their breath, particularly, electricians, also, agents ourselves, in terms of, it's going to be a marathon, but at maximum capacity. It's going to be continuous. And I think, it's going to be really interesting, I think, as we begin to ramp up, because even we start in Q4 this year, that's when the wave starts to build this year. We're only really, 3 or 4 months away now from it beginning to kind of go. And this is why it's important to have this conversation now, I feel, because I think you look at a peak and you go, oh, peak's 26. I'll worry about it next year. And you go, well, actually, no, those in 24, then going into 25. And if you've got due dates that are into 24, into 25, and into 26, this impacts everyone. And that is pretty much the vast majority of the housing stock in the UK, residential letting stock anyway. So And that's why it becomes even more important, like you said, Lee, to try and break the cycle of getting yourself out of this crazy chain that we keep going through.
Yeah, so 2026, it's quite clear that the industry can't handle it. Us as a national contractor, we won't be able to handle all of the demand. Fixflo as a marketplace, again, won't be able to handle all of the demand. It is going to be a case of first come, first serve, and it's going to feel like that. So we had a 400% increase, literally like a gunshot out of nowhere back in 2021. And that's just the work that we did. Don't worry about the ones that we told the customer we couldn't get round to, so they had to go and find someone else and end up outside of the kind of spans of control that we have, that we abide by being an NIC approved contractor. That we just had to turn them away. So 400% increase is just talking about what we actually did, let alone what we turned away. So yeah, scary figures, and it doesn't really bode well to just sit here scaremongering. But it's nice to have a bit of hindsight. Like often you make decisions and then you learn about them and go, oh, we should have done that. This is that moment where we can say, we wish we did that, but actually we're gonna do it again now. And we're probably gonna do it every 5 years until I'm underground. So we might as well start trying to spread awareness of it now.
Yeah, that's the nature of this graph, is that it looks like this right now, but you can see the line starting to slope up again in 2028, and this is going to look exactly like this come 2030, 2031. It's a recurring task that is just going to keep on coming around. So getting ahead of it and trying to even out this graph so there's a regular demand every single year is going to be huge for letting agents. We actually did some maths. There are 4.6 million residential properties in this country. In order to get them all done in one single year, all of your EICRs done in one single year, there would have to be 12,602 completed every single day. I mean, to get them done in just 2 years, it'd be 6,301 done in every single day. That's a huge amount of demand that there just isn't the supply for, I think.
Yeah, it is a good stat that just backs up the vast numbers of it. It's not a small corner of the UK. It's the whole thing, and it is going to be a problem everywhere. And again, just if I was an agent dealing with landlords, I'd just be screaming and shouting about this now, because a little bit of effort now will save you a lot of headaches later. There's nothing worse than I suspect being an agent being slap bang in the middle between a landlord who ultimately is paying you for the service and getting screamed and shouted at because you can't find a contractor to go and do it, or you've got all these unforeseen things popping up. Just save yourself the stress.
Definitely. I think as big as those numbers are, I think as well, because we're so kind of tunnel visioned on EICRs, even as part of this conversation, and Lee, you touched on it, I think this chart doesn't represent the total amount of work for an electrician. All the reasons you call on an electrician today will still exist during this time. All the breakdowns, all the other kind of new installation work that you need doing, like second fix stuff, it's all still there. So in addition to that, electricians are busy people anyway. So they're earning a good living in the absence of EICRs right now. So when you introduce that as well, I think it really starts to introduce, and you start to get a sense of the scale in terms of the job volume that's going to be floating around, and all the risks that we talked about if we don't kind of act on it.
Yeah. So Lee, obviously, PropSat was operating during the last go around of these, sort of 2020 to 2022. Do you have any kind of relative data as to if there was like what the peak looked like versus the wind down after everything happened? Like, was it a massive drop, or was it a slow wind down?
Yeah, I think we felt a pretty significant increase and decrease that was pretty much mirrored, not too dissimilar from the graph that you displayed, really, because there was that immediate knee-jerk reaction of this must be done by April 2021. So I think begrudgingly people managed to hit that target, probably only just, and I'm sure there's lots of examples of people that didn't. So yeah, it was quite an increase, and then again back to business as usual. But like Dean said, we've got a lot of work to do outside of EICRs. This is just something that was dropped on us 4 or 5 years ago and said, right, you've now got to take care of this, and this is of national importance. You must be able to deal with this. So yeah, absolutely. And we're finding that the remedial works off the back of it were unbelievable. So I think it was about 35% of EICRs in the private rental sector were failing or getting those unsatisfactory points that needed remedial works. So although we had a drop off in the initial EICR volumes, that remedial work carried over. And again, it's really tough for a landlord because they've only got 28 days to resolve it. Some of this work, we just could not book it within that time frame. I mean, we had properties that needed a full rewire, which is about the most invasive thing that we could possibly do at a property. The tenant has to move out while we're doing it because we literally have to take it back to brick and rewire the entire property. So again, we're in a position that all of a sudden the demand for EICRs has gone down, but there's still a huge backlog of trying to catch up with the remedial works that carried on for quite a while, if I'm honest. And again, probably comes down to that new legislation leniency that landlords weren't getting hammered for it. And if they did, they'd have to turn around and say to the local authority, well, I can't get it done any sooner because the electrical labour is just not there to deal with it. I think part of that as well is we itemise everything on our EICRs, which goes straight back to the client. So it's completely transparent and visible. And the reason that we do that was not to say we're holier than thou and our pricing is the best. It's to be really upfront and honest, say, here's your certificate, here's why it failed, here's exactly what we need to do to remedy it, and here's our exact price. We did that in the hope that landlords would find that useful because they could potentially go elsewhere and find some labour who would have the bones of what needs to be done. It was that desperate in terms of timing. It was so important that we got that done. And again, our prices are stable. We've got an agreement with Fixflo now that our prices are fixed in and won't be changing at least till the end of the year. So that is us trying to offer some confidence and some grace to the Fixflo marketplace that let's try and get this all done now. Let's try and get as much of it done now before invariably things will change. I mean, like I said, we got stumped by Rishi Sunak's announcement yesterday. So I feel like this is now the second most interesting conversation in the UK. But yeah, we're going to have volatility in our market if we change government or all of these things that can impact it. But we've made a commitment to the Fixflo marketplace that our rates will stay consistent until the end of the year. Beyond that, it's hard for us to control that. There could be all sorts of things going on, right? All these unforeseen circumstances. But right now, it's locked in and we can deal with it. So let's give ourselves all a head start.
Agreed. I think there's something in, we joke about obviously the announcement of the general election yesterday, but I think earlier on, Lee, you were talking about some of the kind of fines for non-compliance that are available and question marks over whether local authorities really understood before and how they understand it now. I think, if you take a step back, we talk about political climate having an impact on our business. I think, the general expectation is that we have a Labour government coming in. So part of that manifesto will include housing and good quality housing stock. They're going to be looking for the levers that they can pull. Existing legislation and enforcement is a big part of that. And EICRs and the safety of tenants, it's a rightly so. It's a very important and hot topic, and I think the enforcement is only going to increase this time round, the next time round, and from here on in, because this legislation wasn't introduced for no reason, and obviously there's got to be consequences for non-compliance. So I think that's an interesting dynamic. I think in terms of perhaps something we haven't thought about till now. But yeah, I think there's obviously people at risk getting caught out if they don't deal with it. I think, and recognising the problem is the first stage to solving it, isn't it? And I think the problem is the capacity that versus the demand. So we're definitely going to, just by being involved in this discussion, I think is a key positive step.
Absolutely. If anybody watching does want information about how Fixflo can help, Fixflo Contractor Marketplace, you will be able to either scan a QR code at the end of the webinar or enter your details in the survey we will circulate afterwards. So that's probably quite enough doom and gloom and fear mongering. So we can move on to what agents can actually do about the problem. Just a reminder to everybody that we have Dean and Lee can answer your questions. So if you do have any, remember to put them in the Q&A box which you can just click on the Zoom window. So Dean and Lee, what can PMs and landlords actually do to avoid getting caught up in this crisis?
I think it's just being aware and communicating that with their landlords, because they've got the tools to deliver this and to make it a fairly seamless process and actually make this a bit of a non-event. I mean, we've spent the best part of 40 minutes talking about why this is a problem and all these different things, but actually you can make this such a non-event. You just get in touch with your landlords, try and illustrate some of the points that we've made to them. I'm sure Fixflo and we will jump on any calls and be able to explain anything to individual groups if they want to recover some of this, but get that awareness out there, get it booked in and get it completed, and then you can forget about this. This won't be a problem for you, which I know is so simplistic saying that, and I'm a bit more pragmatic than that. I mean, it's like studying for an exam, isn't it? It's like, well, how often do you start 3 months early, or how often do you just try and cram it at the end? So I get it, but I think the Fixflo marketplace is going to give you a really good back pocket tool to just help deliver this.
I think from our perspective, and I think through conversations that I've had, customers and things like that, and same on the contractor side, is there seems to be two hurdles, two issues to overcome. The first is to explain to landlords why it's in their interest to move their EICRs a bit earlier than the current due date. Even 6 months can have quite a big difference. So if we were to talk about it in monetary terms, standard EICR costs, if you were to nudge it forward by 6 months, that's probably about 20 quid's worth of compliance time on the ticket, to potentially save hundreds in that year and the years to come, to avoid silly pricing, all the capacity issues, problems getting back to remedials, risk non-compliance. That seems like a really obvious starting point for me, I think. I think property managers probably have an idea, particularly of their longer term landlords who are kind of in their properties in it for the long term. And if they were around for the last one, and they're around for this one, they probably fall within that bracket. I think, that's a real easy kind of conversation to have, I think, in terms of, for the sake of 20 quid, we should probably do this because it's going to save hundreds in the long run and ensure that you're compliant. I think that's kind of the first point. The second for me is securing that resource and that capacity to deliver it. It's all about trying to flatten this curve for yourself, so you're kind of using more capacity in the less peak times, and trying to stretch it out a bit, because it's going to, like Lee said, it's about making this a non-issue for yourselves, and by having those conversations now, securing the resource, whether that be through your existing kind of contractors or accessing contractors via the marketplace, PopCert, Eco Approach are there to support along with other contractors. If there's any knowledge, I think that we can share that will support property managers having those discussions, I think we would certainly be kind of open to that. If there's anything we can do to support, I think is probably the key thing. And as Lee said, there's a lot of negativity around the ICRs and the volumes and all the issues that we've experienced. And whilst it can seem quite negative, I think it's important to have that frank conversation and say, this is the reality of the situation, this is what we experienced last time. But I think for this part of the chat, I think really all is not lost, and some of the remedies are quite simple. It's just about nudging some dates, it's about securing some capacity. Start having those conversations now, because it will benefit you in the long run, I think, and it makes life easier for a lot of people. And ultimately, happier tenants, happier landlords. Yeah, that's what we're kind of all here for, isn't it? So,
absolutely. I mean, as you say, even pulling things forward 6 months to this half of the second half of 2024 rather than the first half of 2025 is going to make a difference price wise, but also timing wise for your landlords and for their properties. You could even just send that graph to your landlords and say, this is what the situation is going to look like next year. Do you want me to do it early? Could be a good strategy to go.
Yeah, maybe that graph with an average cost line across it going like that as the peak emerges. Yeah, I think that probably is quite useful. But I think that's where Fixflo, I think we're uniquely positioned where we kind of have those insights, and I think it's important to share with everyone's obviously going to understand their own kind of world, and I wonder how many kind of property managers are beginning to map out their own EICR kind of requirements over the next 2 years. Obviously, that information is easily accessible within Fixflo and the compliance matrix. So I think it'd be quite useful for people to kind of visualize their own peaks and troughs and how it aligns with ours, and see if there's opportunities to nudge some kind of jobs along and get them in the quieter times. I think that was probably a useful step to take.
Absolutely. We at Fixflo also have a couple of PDF explainers about EICRs that I will circulate in the follow-up email after this webinar to anybody who might want to read them and use them to share this information with your landlords. I've just seen that we've had a couple of questions come in, so shall we move on to answering them? Kareem Redone says, does Amendment 3 of the 17th edition apply only to metal consumer units in new installations, or does it also require upgrades to existing installations? Since the consumer unit in our property is located within a fire-resistant cupboard and not in a route of escape, does this location mitigate the need for immediate upgrade to a metal consumer unit under current regulations? It's quite a complex one. Lee, do you have any information on that?
Yeah, so I believe it would just be to new installations, but I think what would be good is if we have any nuanced specific property questions, it would be good if we could get Kareem's contact details and we could reach out to him. We could have our QS on the phone to Kareem just to specify any individual property needs.
Yeah, Kareem, let us know if you're happy for us to share your information with Lee, and I can put you in touch with him after the webinar.
Not putting Lee on the spot there at all with a very technical question to be answered in Q&A. I think Lee took the right approach. Take that away and have the conversation.
Yeah, we have a head of electrical services who's a technical lead. So I think if anyone wants some specific property advice, I think it's just better to have those conversations directly rather than in the forum for everyone.
Fabulous. I've just seen you've sent your email over, Kareem, so we will put you in touch with Lee after this webinar. So an anonymous person says, what is the standard price for an EICR? I'm assuming this is talking about at the moment ahead of all of the increases that we're speculating are going to happen next year.
From a marketplace perspective, obviously, I think we'd probably get a better view of the whole of market. I think prices certainly vary by region. And ultimately, the cost of an EICR is determined by how many circuits are in a consumer unit. So typically for up to 10 within an EICR, you're probably looking in the region of about 160 to 170 pound plus VAT, kind of standard non-peak pricing. But that can increase or decrease depending on the region. So, down here in London, I think you'd probably find it difficult to achieve that pricing. But it will vary. But I think probably £170 plus VAT is probably like an average aggregate, or lower end 160 for up to 10 circuits, and then beyond that, there's typically an additional fee for each circuit. So the more bedrooms you have is a good sign that there's more kind of circuits involved.
Of course, the studio is going to cost a lot less than a 5-bedroom house.
Yeah, possibly, yes, but perhaps not less than a 3-bed. So it varies, depends on the circuits.
Great. So Jackie Thompson has asked, how does the date of the EICR work if EICRs are completed 3 to 6 months before the due date? Will landlords feel like they've been cheated out of a few months?
Yeah, I could probably lead on this one. So the date of the inspection is the date that's going on the certificate. That we haven't got any grace to kind of do the inspection early, but then allow the testing date to be managed to a few months later to try and match that up. But I think it's a good point, Jackie, because like the first thing that people think about are the commercials of this. And I understand, because it's probably led by the expectations of the gas safety certificates that we have to do for everyone every 12 months. You don't want to bring a gas cert forward by 3 months because, yeah, you're right, you're losing 25% of the value of it. However, if an EICR is valid for 3 to 5 years, I think if you could try and have that conversation with a landlord about a 3-month period, like Dean said, you're looking at it's only a few quid really to bring that forward. And it's just then trying to manage the expectations of what this looks like if you do leave it until day dot and you risk missing compliance. That I think is the big message there, is that this is not a gas safety certificate. It's not a 12-month deal. You are looking at 3 to 5 years on average.
Great. I think that is all of the questions that anybody has submitted. If anybody has any more, now is the time to whack them in the box. But Dean, Lean, do you have any closing thoughts? Did I just say Dee and Lean? Lee and Dean.
How did you know our double act on the weekend? But we kept our musical interests separate.
Yeah, I think my closing thoughts are we got to weigh very lightly in the Q&A. So thank you for that. Yeah, I think my closing thoughts are positive, actually. The issue here is well understood. I think, Jackie's question for me kind of sums up what a lot of people will be feeling and the questions that they'll be having. And I think, I think we're definitely keen to hear from customers in terms of how we can support that process of visualize and explaining to landlords why action is required, because no action would lead to a similar experience the last time, and we obviously want to avoid that. I'm looking forward, silly enough, to this wave, and obviously all the challenges that it brings, and delivering for customers and working with people like Lee and contractors in our marketplace to kind of mobilise ourselves as best as we possibly can to kind of meet the challenge. I think it's going to be a fun ride. I think is probably the best way to explain it.
Ooh. We have actually just then had a few more questions through. So, Dean, you might have spoken too soon about getting off lightly in the Q&A.
God, no.
So, Hannah, yes, we will be sending out a recording of this in the next couple of days, probably tomorrow. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. Janine says, what remit do landlords have against electricians who didn't complete works correctly? For example, an EICR completed in 2021, which on review was only issued for 3 years, and then reinspection for this year has thrown up a load of works.
So ultimately, it's a case-by-case basis. You'd be able to, at the bottom of the certificate, you should be able to see the electrician's details, and it should have a branding on there as to whether they're NIC or NAPIT or which accreditation they follow. If you have doubts behind an EICR that was done, you can raise that with the accreditation bodies. They will investigate it and they'll go through the actions for you. That's exactly what that mechanism's there for. However, as I mentioned slightly earlier, you will find variation between electricians, and this is why it can be frustrating for landlords, because you might have 2 electricians assess the exact same property and there'll be variations in their recommendations. It's based on their experience and based on their assumptions about how that property is going to be lived in and managed and used over the next, say, 5 years. That electrician might have only been willing to put his name on that certificate for up to 3 years because he might have had concerns about the property aging and the tenants that are using the property. Whereas you might find another electrician just doesn't have those concerns or those thoughts. So you will find that, and there will definitely be deliberation. I mean, we've seen it both sides. We've had properties that we failed and someone else has come in and said, well, my neighbour's an electrician and he's told me it's all fine. We'll go through and give you our best clarification of it, but we're only upholding our standards of what we think is safe and what isn't. There will be some degree of there's space for deliberation in there, and that is what makes it really difficult. But you've just got to follow the official guidance. I mean, we're NIC, EIC approved contractors. We follow what we believe are the highest standards in terms of our recruitment and onboarding and safety processes, as well as the regulations that everybody should be following as well. So yeah, unfortunately, you're going to have to go through the accreditation boards, and how much value there is in that and what you get off the other side of it, I'm not sure, to be honest with you, because it as long as that electrician has done his duty and followed those regulations, that element of opinion is hard to hard to really disprove as being incorrect.
Thank you for that answer. Somebody said, can we please have a copy of the graph that you showed earlier? I will send that around in the follow-up email. Don't you worry. Then somebody else asked, do you need to complete a new EICR with every tenancy change?
No, so it's the date that's important for the property. I think this comes off the back of prior to the regulations you would see on an EICR. It would often say change of tenancy. And that was something that needed to be addressed when these regulations came out, because that just throws it all into disarray, doesn't it? How can you say 5 years and then next year, if that tenant moves out, you've got to change it? So that's part of the old verbiage of how to protect your properties and how to be safe with the electrics. Now it is the dates that you've got to be focused on.
Great. And then somebody else asked, does the expiry date go from the date of inspection or the date of the completion of any remedial works?
Good question, actually. This is
a good question.
There's a little bit of complication about this, right? So you have to have a valid EICR on your property, right? We all hopefully know what that looks like with the certification that comes through, and the dates will be on there. If the property fails and you've got an unsatisfactory EICR, you then get the remedial work completed within 28 days. The question that this ties into is, do I need a valid EICR that says satisfactory written after the end of it? And the really annoying, technical, boring answer is no, because an unsatisfactory EICR coupled with the minor works certification that you get that will specifically address and itemize the things on the EICR, those as a combined are actually okay for the legislation, which we take a company-wide view of and think that's rubbish because that's really confusing for people. So what we will always do as a company is, once we've done the remedial works, we'll then issue a satisfactory EICR that just looks like you've only got one document that you have to hand and show around and give to tenants, rather than trying to say, well, I've got an unsatisfactory EICR here, but here's evidence I did the work within 28 days and all those points are ticked off. So together, here you go. That it's complicated, and it was a bit of a strange way of working. But if you go down that route and have the two complicated bits together, it will be the date on the EICR still. If you get the remedial works done and an EICR done after, we'll put that day's date on it.
I think that makes a lot more sense as a way of going about it.
Yes, a head scratcher.
So sort of relatedly, Cream has asked, what is the maximum length an EICR can be valid for?
So an EICR for the rental sector is now mandated at 5 years. The only curveball that I've got to throw at you on this one is if you have a brand new installation, so you've done an absolute strip down and rewire, that EIC certificate, not EICR, the EIC, the electrical certification for that will be valid for 10 years. But again, I think for the simplicity of what you're going to be dealing with as agents and landlords, is for the private rental sector, 5 years is the maximum.
Great. And somebody else has asked, what percentage of circuits in a property need to be tested for an EICR?
100. Every circuit needs to be tested. And I suspect the reason behind that question might be to do with the accessories. So we will test 100% of circuits. We have to get readings for absolutely everything. But then there's a bit of a phased approach to, if you test that circuit, and you have to then test a minimum of 10% of the accessories on that circuit. If you then find issues with those accessories, you then have to go another 10%, and so on and so forth. Again, company-wide policy, we just find it easier and more beneficial to just test everything. So 100% of circuits, 100% of sockets, switches, lights, then we can't miss anything, rather than relying on those assumptions. So yeah, great question. And I suspect that's loaded to the accessory testing, but not to be confused with a PAT test, mind you. That's the portable appliance test, is anything with a plug, kettles, toasters, fridges, microwaves, TVs, whatever you might leave for your tenants. They are outside the remit of an EICR. They're a PAT test.
Great. And then our last question, can you confirm that an EICR is still required if an electrical installation certificate is provided? Again,
just tying back into my answer on the last one. So if that's within date, again, you'll have a fixed date on that certification. They are valid for 10 years. We've had it before, actually, where a landlord had taken it to their agent outside of the Fixflo marketplace, and they'd taken the EIC and said, right, we've had a brand new installation done, fully rewired, all done by us. And that agent refused it. because they didn't really know what they were looking at. And it's such a minor difference between an EICR and an EIC in terms of the actual document and the template of it itself. So from our perspective, we just wrote them out a full EICR. We went and completed that because it just made it easier rather than trying to fight the powers that be and get that through, even though we know what we're saying is correct. An EICR is easier to have.
Great. I know I literally just said that was going to be the last question, but 2 more have just popped in. Are you 2 happy to sit in for a few minutes longer? I know that we're slightly overrunning.
Yeah, of course.
I'd like to apologise because I assume it's my mum sending all of these questions. I thought she'd be the only one here to watch us.
So somebody has asked, where a shorter retest date is given, for example, 1 year or 3 years, is this a recommendation, or does the EICR only retain validity for that period?
Yeah, exactly that. It is only going to retain that validity period. And again, comes down to the property itself. Although there might not have been urgent remedial works required or things that deemed it to be unsatisfactory as per the regulations, that electrician is ultimately unhappy with something at the property if it's only been written for 1 year. I suppose you've got to think of it as that electrician's accreditation is on the line here. Is he willing to put it on the line for 5 years? The answer was no in that property. Might be that it's a very old property, although there wasn't anything wrong with it as per the regs. It could be something that he thinks should be tested more frequently. So absolutely, that would be the validity period, and there will be good reason behind that.
Great. So Phil Keddy has asked, if you have a property that the tenant does not allow full access for, or if there's a load of junk that's not been moved, what can you do?
Yeah, difficult. I mean, we'll do everything we can to get full access to the property. There are mechanisms to go down if you're not going to reach compliance on the basis of your tenant is refusing access and other bits and bobs. That if the local authority were pursuing you for that, you've got mitigation there. Not exactly sure what that mechanism looks like, how efficiently that's dealt with. It's probably a local authority specific route, I suspect. But your tenant does ultimately need to play ball here. I mean, you can let us in and you can go with us and give us a set of keys, but if they're a hoarder and access is just not available, then there's not a lot we can do about it. We haven't got the time and scope to be clearing houses extensively. I mean, of course, we'll shift a sofa or move a bed if need be to access a socket, but ultimately we do need a bit of collaboration on that.
I think also this is where we've had some similar kind of experiences shared. Fixflo, I think an audit trail is a key thing here, as you were saying, Lee, about, there's some mitigating circumstances if, through comments, able to easily evidence that the contractor's tried on X date to make contact, gain access. You're able to demonstrate that efforts have been made, and I think that's the key thing here. Ensuring that we're able to kind of document and tie back to what efforts have been made to gain access.
Thank you. I'm going to say that if anybody has any further questions, please put them in the survey box that we're going to send around after this webinar, and we will answer them after the webinar, because I don't want this to go on too much longer. We'll just take one more. Is the landlord required to provide the tenants with a copy of this? And if he does not, what is the consequence?
Yeah, really straightforward answer on that. Yeah, the legislation is really clear. You do have to provide that to your tenants within 28 days of the tenancy commencing. What's the consequences if they don't? Ultimately, it would be just falling in that non-compliance bracket. Probably important as to what Dean said earlier is, can you prove that you've provided that to them? If you hand it to them and just leave it in the property, how do you document that? Probably best to email a digital copy, because then that's there and it's infinite. You've got access to that. So yeah, absolutely. It's the whole point behind this is demonstrating the safety of that property to the tenant. I think that's probably the most overarching theme here, is that it's about tenants and the safety of tenants. So I'm sure they'll be just as keen to see that and have that confidence that they're living in a safe space, especially if they've got young kids and everything else that goes with that. So yeah, absolutely provide certificates to the tenants. And I would suggest doing it by email or an online portal or a platform that you've got. So you've got the audit trail of that as well.
Great. Thank you, Zara, for that question. Related to the previous one about access, Mozingani has just suggested that in Scotland, access can be arranged via a first-tier tribunal in the Housing and Property Chamber. And there's a form on their website for any Scottish agents who may need access.
Awesome.
So let's wrap up. Thank you both for your time today. Really, really great information that you shared with us. And thank you, Lee, so much for getting down into the nitty-gritty with all of those questions. If anybody would like any information on how Fixflo can help with doing your EICRs and automating those, so it's a lot more hands-off for you, you can scan this QR code or give your details to us in the survey box that will be available after this webinar ends. If anybody would like to follow any of us on LinkedIn, these are the QR codes that you can scan to do that. So I'll just leave those on the screen for a moment. But yeah, thanks again for your time, Lee and Dean. It's been great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers. All right. Have a really great day, everyone. I will send the recording around in the next couple of days. So yeah, have a fantastic day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.